hear drummers, as you guys are well aware. You hear one occasionally, but there's not really enough data there to put a trend on Shawnee State Forest. So anyway, this trapping effort, we viewed it as a way to make a population comparison, another index for population level, specifically compared to the areas that we trapped in the late 90s. So we're making the same trapping effort, not necessarily the same number of traps, because we had 5 work units at that point, and their goal was just to catch as many grouse as possible for that study. This was a little bit smaller scale, but we can compare the trap days, the trap effort, to that previous effort. It's simply number of traps open and the number of days that they're open. You multiply those two and you get the trap days. So if you've got 10 traps open for 2 days, you've got 20 trap days. So we're tracking that with this effort. That was tracked in the late 90s. We can compare the two. Now, as I mentioned, unfortunately we don't have any grouse captured for this effort. We're right around 200 trap days. The average at that time for Ohio, and that's all the work units, was about 3.5 birds per 100 trap days. So it was, it wasn't an extremely high capture rate even at that time, but we should have expected 6 to 8 birds if we were capturing birds at that same rate for this effort. So anyway, disappointing results. What it suggests to us, it's not that there are no birds in Shawnee State Forest. I think we all recognize that that's not the truth, but they're likely at such a low density that they're not encountering these passive traps in the ways that we deploy them. So, you've got birds at a certain density, the likelihood that they're going to encounter one of these traps and be funneled into a cage is much higher. So, with that, we'll talk a little bit. Are there any questions about that, why we're here? 60,000 fairly contiguous acres and some disturbance that we would consider positive for rough grouse. It's one of that's the primary reason we keyed in on this. And any questions about why the trapping effort or anything like that? All right. So the traps we'll go look at today, basic structure is right here. You've got a wire mesh cage, and this is just a rough diagram, but you've got a wire mesh cage with a funnel entrance, which is pretty standard in capturing a lot of wildlife. The quail traps were just like this for my master's project. As I mentioned, there are a number of other traps. So you want an entrance about the size of your fist for a rough grouse. They're funneled in. Once they're in this cage, they can't find that small entrance to get back out. They just kind of circle around and around, and you'll see that.
Brain.
You've got a chicken wire lead in between the two traps. So you've got an end cage with one entrance, you've got a center cage with 2 entrances, one on each side, and between that you've got chicken wire leads. Now the interesting thing, talking about the bird brain, it's very interesting. You picture, we probably all have heard the turkey hunter say, or maybe you are a turkey hunter and you've encountered this, oh, the bird hit a fence. You would certainly think a bird would just go right over that fence if it wanted to cross it. They generally don't. They hit an obstacle, and sometimes they just don't. They follow that obstacle, and that's the idea here. Is the bird encounters that lead, it knows it's headed this direction, and it just tries to find a way around, and it follows that lead until it hits the funnel on the cage and ends up in that cage before it gets around the obstruction. Now that's not to say some birds aren't going over the lead, but enough of them follow the lead that you end up with some captures in these cages. That's the general idea.
How long are those, the leads?
150 feet is one lead. So a full trap would be 300 feet. We will go look at one full trap, and then there's a couple other spots where we were only able to put out a half trap, what we'll call a half trap. So you can also eliminate this middle cage and just put 2 end cages in between one stretch of lead. And the challenge there is 300 feet or 150 feet doesn't seem like that long, but you get into the woods and you really want that lead to be arrow straight. Because if you put a bend in it and that bird is walking along that fence and it's got a bend off to the right, that bird might just veer off and head right into the woods, and you've just sent it away from your cage, essentially. So we try to get those leads as straight as we possibly can, which certainly can be a challenge. Anywhere other than the haul road, and we did trap some haul roads in between good cover types and so forth.
So the traps are in the thick woods?
Some we got into the cover. The majority we got onto all old haul roads that we were able to.
When you say an old haul road, would that be where I would think just a little logging track running up the hillside?
Right, so not
the hillside?
not gravel.
I understand. Yeah,
so,
just a track running up the hill.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So generally herbaceous vegetation, some overhead canopy from the nearby trees, but fairly easy for us to clear a lane, because you want to clear a lane where that grouse can move. You don't want it to be such dense vegetation that they're not even encountering the fence.
When you are clearing those lanes, are you mowing it?
We did mow some, so we brought a bush hog down and ran a few logging roads. And opened a fairly wide area, and then placed traps on those. Others we hand cleared, so brought in
like a
weed whacker with steel blades.
Got it.
So that they could whack a little bit more substantial vegetation than we encounter in our yards. Yeah.
Cut out those wild roses that are growing up in there.
So they'd clear a path for that not only the cages but the leads. Try to keep that vegetation down somewhat so that birds are not only encountering the fence but then have a clear path to move to a cage.
There are not many people walking those things this time of year.
You are correct. We've not encountered too many, but I have started to see some trail riding activity pick up as we've cooled off. So horses.
Horses. Okay, I got you.
So
ATVs.
Yeah, not ATV, horseback.
Okay.
So it's probably a good time for us to bring the trapping effort to a close. We've got bow season coming in this coming weekend. And as I mentioned, it's been pretty warm down here. I can't picture horseback riding is that popular during these real hot months. But as I mentioned, trap check last night, I did see some evidence that horses have been on the trail. So there's a little bit of concern that they would encounter those traps and
in the areas where you have these, has there been any sort of signage posting that grouse trapping is going on in this area?
No, we've not advertised on the trailhead.
Okay.
We have placards on all of our traps that identify it as property of the state of Ohio, as Division of Wildlife, please do not tamper, so forth. And the primary concern there would be someone encounters that, does not recognize what it is, thinks that it's something that someone has constructed for whatever reason. Not to mention to hopefully deter someone from, again, tampering with those traps if they just want to cause trouble.
The cages, do they have top on them?
Mesh top, yes. So it's a I think it's a nylon fabric. What you would typically see in a
like
outdoor flight cage, like a pheasant farm or something like that. And then we brush them over, give the birds anything that's captured, give them shade, conceal them from aerial predators, and we can go over a bunch of that in the field as well.
All right.
So, what am I missing?
Grouse.
Listen, bird.
The obvious.
Maybe there's going to be a bird in a trap.
You talking about those turkey sage grouse out there in Montana? They actually have white clippings on the top floor of the fence because the birds will fly.
They fly in and decapitate themselves on this, is what I've heard. One of the things that go ahead, Pete.
This is just an anecdote. A few years ago, I was in Pennsylvania. The Grouse Society puts on an upland bird hunt up in the Allegheny National Forest, and I've been one of the huntsmen up there. And I had my two guys, and we were going. Actually, we were in a state game land, and we're working through the woods, and there's a lot of oil and gas collection going on up there, and there was I'm going to call it like a retention pond, and kind of high. It was kind of swampy down there, and I had the guys going down there, And I'm going up to take a look at this thing, and it's all fenced around there, you know, I guess about 4 inches by 4 inches. And I'm getting up there, and I'm looking at this fence, and I see something, and I go up there, and actually it was a double fence. One row, and then another, and the squares were kind of offset. There was a grouse stuck in one of those things. And it was dead. It was probably about this high off the ground. And it had been eviscerated. Yeah. So
What's that mean?
guts were
Sliced
taken
open.
out. Yeah. I think some critter got to it and just. I don't
Well,
know,
probably
what
poked at it after it already and sliced itself
Could be.
pretty good.
Well, no, it didn't look like it had been sliced because the fence was just wire. There was no barbed wire or anything like that. So
But even a
it
wire at that, it was still, if it's coming in with some velocity, it's still going to get cut off.
Yeah.
Well, I think the breast was there and the cut was down.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
But so I just took it and gave it to Lisa Williams to check out because we were doing the collection back at that point in time.
Yeah.
Flying right into the fence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which brings me to my next point I want to cover before we get out into the traps. And we'll make 2 stops. I can't take anybody in my vehicle, unfortunately. So you guys will have to make your own arrangements. I wouldn't expect we'll be out there for more than an hour. We're headed to the McEltree Bridle Trail area. We won't be right on that, but that's the general area if you're familiar. So if anybody needs to leave, just do what you need to do. But before anybody does take off, one thing I wanted to bring up, there is stimulated out of some of the work that's been going on in Pennsylvania, there is a West Nile virus study proposed for some from the Appalachian region. Ohio has agreed to participate. Pennsylvania, of course, would be contributing samples. I think there are a couple other states involved. In essence, the state will collect their own blood samples from grouse hunters, harvested birds. We will send those down to a Southeast Disease Research Facility, one that we have utilized for a number of years for disease issues. So it has been coordinated in Pennsylvania largely. They're asking for cooperation from states. I have let them know that we will not be sending a very large sample for a variety of reasons. Our diary participants last year, I believe, killed 6 birds. So, I mean, those are the folks that I will contact. Likely information will come out when I send out diaries at the beginning of the season. I may even be selective somewhat about who I contact for that, because some of our hunters have even said to me, I'm not at the point where I'm going to pull the trigger on a grouse anymore. I still like to get out, exercise the life, and so forth. So that hunter, I probably will leave out of the sample. But if there's somebody that I've got that has harvested birds recently in recent years, and I think that there's a reasonable chance that they will, I'll send them an extra envelope with some of the disease collection material.
Blood sampling kit.
Yeah, and it's not. Pete, maybe you've seen it. It's not really a substantial.
It's just like a litmus
dipstick.
strip, right?
Like a
Little, they call it a blood filter strip. Can remember where I had them stashed. So I think there's 100 in here. So there's not much to them.
That's about a 10-year supply.
I'll just take one.
So you can see there's not much to it. This narrow part here would need to be saturated with blood. Takes about a drop of blood. Doesn't take much. I think Lisa's guidance has been, as you're cleaning the bird, dip it in a little bit of blood from the animal. I think you would run into challenges if you kill a bird in the morning and the cleaning of that evening with coagulation and so forth. So it might just take a little bit of planning in that regard. But that's all it would take. Then air dried. They don't have to be stored in any real special way. I'll provide guidance on that.
Okay.
But They are fairly simple.
So are they just looking for West Nile?
That would detect
other-
West Nile antibodies. So that won't detect active infection of West Nile, which really should be sort of waning at this point. The peak infection time is sort of August, September, and then they start to drop off as we get into fall, just like mosquitoes drop off.
So how long does it stay in the bird? Does it die?
The antibodies will be present, as I understand it, for the life of the bird, which isn't very long, of course, for a rough grouse. But as I understand it, those antibodies would be present until that bird's death. So what you are actually detecting, and this is pretty important for you all to understand, because I know there's been a lot of concern about West Nile recently. What that's detecting is a bird that has been infected or exposed, whether or not the infection took right, correct. But that bird has developed antibodies because it's been exposed to that West Nile virus and is still living, at least up until the point it was harvested. So what you get is a count, a percentage, a proportion of the birds in the population, assuming that hunters are taking birds randomly from the population that have been exposed and survived West Nile virus. If we wanted any information on active infection, we'd have to take birds in August. Yeah, I mean that was one of the considerations for this trapping study. Is are we going to be at a period of time where we might be able to get some information on active infection? Of course,
That would be helpful.
yeah, I mean it would have. Of course, you have no idea what's going to happen to that bird, and the chances. The belief is that infection is so brief in those birds. The Pennsylvania study with chicks is a good example of that. Many of those birds were expressing pretty serious symptoms, maybe even death, in a fairly short period of time. So the odds of encountering an actively infected bird that hadn't already died or succumbed to the infection were pretty slim. I talked with Lisa Williams a little bit about that and what the chances might be, and it just wasn't something that we were going to be able to really execute. So, hunter-harvested birds and looking for antibodies is probably the best we're going to be able to do. We'll remind you all, too, as sort of active members, board members, presidents, and so forth of RGS chapters. Our message has been, Pennsylvania's message has been, Michigan's message has been, we have to deal with this disease at whatever level it's impacting the grouse population through habitat.
Right.
We cannot vaccinate. We cannot treat. We have to mitigate the effects of this disease through habitat management, producing a population robust enough to survive the bad West Nile years. So the message has not really changed in terms of what are we going to do for grouse. It's always been a habitat issue with some other factors playing a role, such as disease, but it doesn't change what we're going to do in the field in terms of grouse management. So if you have any questions about the disease study, it's just sort of hitting the ground. All the information that the biologists need to get out to the grouse hunters has just come in recently. I've got a little bit of that here, but all of it will be distributed. I think you're all probably diary participants. If you're not, just get a hold of me. It's a simple add you to my list. But that's how I'll contact folks. I have chapter members that for whatever reason don't want to be a diary participant or are not or have not been, but they are interested in being a participant in the disease study, I'd be happy to add them as well. I will say, because this has sort of come up last minute, I mean, it's been in the works, but it's actually hit the ground recently. We haven't budgeted a lot of money for our samples, so we'll likely cap it at around 10 birds. As I mentioned, diary participants only killed 6 last year. So that might not be an issue at all. But if we start getting a lot of samples from folks, we'll have to make some decisions about paying for additional samples. Just wanted to bring that to your attention.
So what was the range? Were they killing from Cooper Hollow to where? Where would the birds go? There's 6 birds. Where have they been killed at?
All over the state, anywhere in the
state
state.
of Ohio?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
the whole
any.
state, huh?
So the diary program, if you're unfamiliar, volunteers have been participating in that since the late 70s, and I've got the report stashed somewhere.
Okay, I thought it was like a region thing.
Well, it is. Regional states participate. So here's the summary from all the Appalachian states for the diary program since 1995. You've got Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, West Virginia. Flush rate, birds flushed per hour. We're orange, down at the bottom, unfortunately, in recent years. But essentially what this is grouse hunters that have kept track of their hunts through the season and then submitted that information to the state agency, and we come up with a calculation of statewide regional flush rate. So in the early 70s we were talking bird and a half roughly flush per hour. So and that's an average. You know, some did better, some did worse.
Yeah.
We've had a pretty steady decline. There was a fairly notable decline in 2003, early 2000s. That's some of the evidence that Pennsylvania Game Commission has used to suggest that this was when we were seeing some West Nile virus infection from songbirds and corvids, jays and crows and so forth. Not a lot of evidence of rough grouse, but as you can imagine, dead rough grouse in the woods late summer, who's ever going to find them?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
You can shoot a rough grouse and have it fall into leaf litter and
You can't find it.
can't find it. So not a lot of people are going to encounter dead rough grouse if they're out there in the woods during that time period. But with some of the studies that they've done, we recognize that there is a susceptibility in grouse to West Nile virus. We know that this was a high rate of infection period for jays and other birds, and crows. Likely there was an impact on grouse here. Now this larger downward trend over a longer period of time, still believe that's primarily driven by habitat change.
But you're creating habitat, which is cool.
In places, but we're not keeping up with maturation rate in our forest, and that's a diagram I did not bring, and I think I've shared with some of you.
Okay, so like, what's the factors of hawks, skunks, coon, possum?
They
You
all-
think about, so let's eradicate all of them and start a new study and see if the bird population comes up.
So,
Can we do that? Maybe we get the state on that?
so I will say
They don't have enough money to send in blood samples.
No
let alone-
one, no one traps, no one coon hunts, or back in the 70s, a coon was worth $30. Now they're worth $3. So people are like going, you got
And
all
it's-
these fur-bearing predators just
and it's-
destroy, and you got all these hawks that we never had before. But
and it is amazing
so it's
to look
incredible
at.
how this is. How you changed how the habitat's being cut,
Mhm.
created, but then
Yep.
the ground stuff, the aerial stuff, are factors
Right.
of everything.
So there are a couple things there. I'm
What's
going to
that?
try to remember to touch on all of them. You are correct with fur bearers. It is amazing to see a diagram of fur prices and the
Yeah.
abundance of fur-bearing species.
Beavers are this big now.
Right. So yeah, coons,
Yeah.
raccoons are an excellent example. You know, the fur price, that pelt price goes down, numbers go up. Price goes up, numbers go down. And it's been down for quite a while now.
Years, yeah.
So you brought up a lot of points with regard to grouse. The analogy I used, think of a bucket. We've got a bucket. That's our habitat, our landscape suitability for grouse in the state. The amount of water in the bucket's the amount of grouse we can have. Every one of those factors that you pointed at is a hole in our bucket.
Big time.
Might be a big hole, might be a little hole, but we're losing grouse. And you're never going to be able to plug those holes. You can mend them, but we do have more hawks than we've had in recent decades. In part, that's
The whole country.
a good thing. But I do remind
Bring back DDC,
Recovery from
DTC.
general biodiversity. Now, I am a representative of state wildlife agency, not just the grouse biologist, but we are charged with protecting wildlife resources for the enjoyment, use of all the state. But hawks also, I will say, because we get this a lot, are federally protected. This isn't even in our wheelhouse.
Right.
Now, we are charged with, upholding federal mandates, rules and regulations for those. But people say, why don't you have a hawk season? Well, that doesn't even, that is not an option. But that is a common question that I get.
Well, it's because the numbers are so high.
Predator
The
numbers
numbers have gone up so high on them.
Predator numbers have changed, and that will have some influence on prey numbers. Generally, prey numbers drive predator numbers, not vice versa. I do remind people of that. Same with quail. Prey numbers drive predator numbers. Predator numbers don't drive prey numbers. That's just a generally accepted rule. Yeah, I lost my words there.
But when you talk about habitat, I'm sorry if I don't.
No, go ahead.
When you talk about habitat, it's my feeling that the role that the state had, say, at least in the 90s, was pretty much a hands-off kind of thing.
And I mean, there are...
Because I'm going to say a lot of litigation from, the Sierra Club and, environmentalists and so forth like that. And the state just didn't want to fight that battle. And there was more focus, my opinion is, more focus on deer and turkey than there was on grouse. We had the Mead Paper Company land, which provided good habitat for grouse around here, and that was open to public hunting. Mead sold it to the Scioto Land Company or whatever, and Scioto Land Company said, we don't want all these people on our property, and shut it down. So there went all the grouse habitat, all the public grouse habitat.
I mean, there are,
overnight.
You bring up a good point that there are a lot of things that have happened in recent decades. Mills, paper companies, those sorts of things. Of course, we don't influence those tremendously.
Right.
But actions that they take certainly influence the forested landscape of Ohio.
Right.
And there are things that have happened in the past that, again, are outside the control of the State Wildlife Agency. As I understand it, there was a cessation of clear cutting for a number of years. I was out with actually a retired forester checking traps earlier in the week, and he talked about that period where there was essentially no clear cutting going on. Now I don't know what other forest management actions might have been taking place. The numbers that I look at in the graph that I wish I had brought now, and again, maybe some of you have seen that period. So of course we had a period of reforestation from 50s, 60s, 70s. That reforestation period, everything starts as young forest. And we had in excess of 3 million acres of young forest habitat in Ohio in the 70s. 3 million acres of essentially grouse habitat scattered throughout the forested region. So the eastern half of the state and then down in the southern part of the state. We're now down around roughly 800,000 acres, which is still a fair amount of what they call seedling, sapling, small diameter trees is how that's broken out. But 3 million acres to 800,000 acres. And then you've got to think that 800,000 acres is scattered across the state and might not be located in regions.
Fragmented, right. Right.
In a landscape where it's suitable for grouse still. So we've had some major changes in forest composition in the state of Ohio. We impact a small amount of that. And we're standing in one of the largest, again, 60,000 acre state forest land. If you go into the Ohio Breeding Bird Atlas, the second round, so Breeding Bird Atlas 2, look at the grouse page. And that's, for those of you that are unfamiliar, that's a volunteer effort. Carried over 5 years. I think it was 2006 to 2011. It was a repeat of an effort done in the mid-'80s. Same thing, 5 years. Volunteers go out, they detect all the birds that they can in a block. You've got block boundaries, go in there as best you can, document all the breeding birds. So rough grouse fall within that, and you get a pretty good distribution map. It doesn't really give you grouse abundance, it gives you grouse distribution. The key areas where we still had grouse detected in 2006 to 2011 fall right on our largest state forests and some of the Wayne National Forest property. There are a few areas where we've got larger wildlife areas in eastern Ohio where there were still some grouse detections, but you don't see a lot outside of that. Now, some of that could have to do with the ability of people to go in and access a property and detect birds. But for the most part, where we've got grouse is where we've got large forest, and where that forest still has some disturbance creating that young forest.
So what made Shawnee so good at one time? When was that all clear cut out? When was where it developed into...
So I don't know much of the history prior to 2000,
Okay.
but 2003 was a massive ice storm.
Yep.
I had
the decline to that.
They were.
So everyone used to. I've never come over and hunt because we was always hunting Wayne National and people and all that kind of stuff. And people on this side of the county, the guys like you would come this way. We was always over that way because we had no reason to come this way. But I would always hear people coming to Shawnee and grouse hunting. And I don't know if it's necessarily Shawnee or just the surrounding areas of Shawnee. Shawnee could have been not necessarily the forest, but that said, back where I'm from, we had all these furnaces like Howard Furnace, Junior Furnace, Franklin Furnace, blah, blah, blah. And they used 2.5 acres of clear-cut timber a day back in their prime in the, like the turn of the century. So therefore, all that clear-cutting that was happening was going to those furnaces, so therefore you kept regenerating growth and growth. So our bird population, as everywhere, was a result of that. Now we're like meat, like you talked about meat, and they clear-cut, they go in, they put in hives, so they can have another cut. It's not like it's... So, and then they select that. People select that because they don't want their forest all tore up, and they buy land and stuff like this. So, I mean, it's an ending battle of what happened. Unless, I mean, you go to Michigan, Wisconsin, you go up and they just wipe the whole thing. And go, what happened to that last year? You walk up there to places we've hunted, we walk back there, we go, where? I mean, you just hear the wheels were cut. Anyway, but they have different levels of growth and generation.
Right. So generally in an aspen area in
was Shawnee that good, or was it just people say what made it that good?
It was good for a number of reasons. The ice storm, and I mean it's again the largest contiguous block. So we surely had science-based forest management occurring prior to 2000 and continues today.
So they clear-cut in here years ago?
I'm sure there were some periods where they have not, but they did in the past, certainly. And again, my history prior to 2000 is going to be a little bit fuzzy. But up to that point, in 2003, a massive ice storm brought down a lot of trees, a lot of natural disturbance. They did some salvage cutting in those areas, so that some of that's what we'll drive through. And I'll try to point that out again. I was out with Forrester a couple days ago. I'll try to point out those areas where he was in marking down timber, salvage, during that ice storm. We did see a bit of a spike in flush rate here following that, a few years afterward. So there's a natural disturbance that was fairly beneficial. A lot of the area that we ran dogs in this February for this volunteer effort prior to the trapping was a fire in 2008, I want to say. And as I understand it, it was a fairly intense fire, called in a lot of the DNR resources to contain it. And I think a lot of mature standing trees were killed during that fairly intense fire. There were some salvage. There's a big block. If you look at that cut map, there's a big block of 2008, 2009, and 2010 cuts. A lot of that was salvage from that fire, as I understand it. So you do have some natural disturbance occurring here a little more frequently than you see elsewhere, and I don't know why that is exactly. Who knows why an ice storm occurs where it does? We need a meteorologist.
We get hit up at our place too.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is just this is 60,000 contiguous acres of forest, so when the ice storm comes, it impacts the forest.
I remember a lot of damage from that ice storm over at Brush Creek, up there around Warren. But that's so close to here anyway.
There was a lot of them down towards in the Wayne or on the northern edge of the Wayne.
We got black hard, that same stuff. That's interesting.
I mean, another part of it is this fairly rugged terrain. Even though don't have a lot of evidence that hunting pressure impacts grouse populations to a significant level. It is possible. And it's possible we just don't have that information. I do not think in this rugged terrain, I think the grouse have a little more of an advantage than a lot of other places.
You shinny up that hill, and he launches off. You ain't going back.
And
That's why we never hunted there. We thought, well, why don't we go up and down these billy goat? I mean, over where it's a little more rolling and we come and, but we have places to hunt and things to do. But, I mean,
so
at that time there was birds everywhere. I mean, it seemed like you could walk out with them, and birds coming up and they were getting clear cut. But that was tough. But yeah, it's hard. It's hard hunting. You're not going to get some heavy, old man going up and down these hills. I mean, the old-time grouse hunters. So, and there's not bird hunters now. I mean, I think there's only a few of us that's got bird dogs, and you see who's here. So there's not like a lot of people. I
mean, we still.
Dogs and stuff, so I don't think the pressure there, but
we still have a fair number that are hunting out of state.
they come over.
People coming from out of state?
No, we're leaving to go.
Yeah, we're fleeing.
Briefly.
So
We put the pressure elsewhere. We're just while you do your work, okay?
right. So I started fly fishing in college, and I remember going to a fly shop in Columbus and asked about some places to go in Ohio. And he said, well, it's not great in Ohio. But he said, you're very lucky you live in Ohio, because you can go to
Michigan, you're in Pennsylvania.
You can go to any state, you can go north, south, east, west, and you can find some good fly fishing. We're getting that way with grouse, unfortunately. We have excellent hunting opportunity in Michigan, fairly good in Pennsylvania, West Virginia. I mean, you see the flush rates that they've got compared to our own. Our statewide average for last season was a flush in 6.5 hours of field. You can be in pretty good grouse hunting in a 5-hour drive.
Right.
Exactly.
And probably get out of the car and hunt for an hour and flush a couple grouse. So, I mean, that is the state that we're in. That is the situation that we're in.
So, as you just said, it takes an hour in Ohio, it takes 6 hours in Ohio to flush one grouse.
On average.
On average. Or you can drive to Pennsylvania or West Virginia and get there in 6 hours and get out birds.
Correct.
I think the conversation needs to be around, from a campaign perspective to the public, is the investment in future hunting for the grouse. It's, we know we're in the dismal numbers right now. Our investment needs to go into our future hunters and generate that interest conservation-wise.
Yes.
But it's funny, my son, who's now 30, I grew up grouse hunting. He never got to enjoy the love that I did. So his love, we go to Michigan, Montana and hunt. But, it's all big game now. There's rabbits, they would have beagles, they was running rabbit and competing and everything with rabbit dogs and that kind of stuff. And it's just funny, we couldn't wait to get up to go hunting. There you go and take a little kid in the woods and walk 4 or 5 hours and why are we doing that? I mean, it's like, this is fun. This is what you like doing. But it's not. It's one of those things where
take a little kid out, dry fly fishing for trout.
Get him on a
bluegill.
You go down.
I get it. I get that. 'Cause I've got 3 boys too.
Turkeys everywhere. Deer run. Everyone, leasing the land. They're begging for land to lease the deer hunt to shoot one deer.
And you bring up a good point that I should mention. And I don't want this to appear as your forest game bird biologist raising the white flag for certain species. But at the landscape level, and I mean the state of Ohio, or the forested half of Ohio, things change in such a way that it's like a changing tide. There's not a lot that you can do to fight the tide. Forest management across the state of Ohio has just changed, and that's private land forest management, public land forest management to a degree. I would like to say that our public land forest management is just improving, because it's more science-based. You know, it's forest inventory analysis. What type of forest are we going to end up with if we make this treatment, you know, on this forest patch? But that is changing across the state. And in the 1970s, we had tremendous grouse numbers because we had nearly cleared the state of Ohio of forest cover in the early part of that century. We tried to farm a lot of it, found out it wasn't really farmable, and gave up on it and allowed it to grow up into forest cover. So through the early part of that century, you've had excellent regenerating forest for rough grouse. That's never something that I think we should do again, especially not in the name of one species. But there are a lot of improvements that can be made to improve grouse numbers in certain areas of the state and to keep this bird in the state. I mean, we're looking at Indiana with a state endangered designation for rough grouse. And I talk with their biologist, and the frightening thing there is he'll tell me, you know, the numbers that you're seeing, the population index levels, and the changes that you're seeing. That's what we were seeing in Indiana. And so we don't want to get to that devastation. We want to veer off of that path.
So that brings up a good question, because when I went up to Columbus, what was that? I guess a year and a half ago, with Gary Obermiller and Mike Miller and those guys like that, they had an appetite for trying to do something for the grouse, which is how this whole trapping thing got started. That was kind of that push. Are you still
at the table with him?
Seeing kind of the top brass at ODNR still interested in? I mean, obviously they're supporting this trapping effort, but are you still seeing anything that they're, I don't know, are they still like checking in on you guys? Like, how's the trapping effort going? Is you still think there's an appetite there for them to continue working on?
So with regard to the trapping effort, I send regular reports up the chain. With the chief. I've not had any direct conversations with him about it. So my reports go up to him with regard to trapping success. In terms of forest management, I would say yes. But that's a slow ball to get moving. Especially to do it in the way that it should be done. So we had some forest inventory analysis done a number of years ago. You may be aware of that. I know NWTF assisted with that in large part. That was to employ essentially a software tool which aids us in making forest prescriptions, specifically those that will end in, hopefully, an oak-dominated forest, which is beneficial for wildlife for a variety of species, grouse included. I mean, acorns are a fall and winter resource that is invaluable to Ohio's forested wildlife. So a lot of times those changes take years to come to fruition. You know, if a stand prescription says, for example, you have no oak generation right now, you've got no oak seedlings, you have no established oak in the understory, it may be a number of years until we can do any sort of release or cut in that stand until we can take some action. So Waterloo, I don't know if any of you go to the Athens area, Athens-Benton County area, they've done a number of burns over the last 3 years.
We hunted Waterloo last year.
So if you're a turkey hunter, I've heard with the burned areas in the spring, they do that burn roughly March. Fantastic for turkey hunting. It's fairly open if you can find a place to hide, but the turkeys really like it. We've burned off a lot of the leaf litter. It's a low temperature, slow burn through the understory. But that is in the name of oak regeneration. And as I understand it, in prepping those areas, getting a better established oak population in the understory so that they can be released through harvest or whatever other means into the overstory canopy. So I would say yes, we are moving in the right direction. Those gears turn slowly. And then state forest, I can't speak specifically to what they do, but I've always been impressed by our state forests in the management action that they take. Again, science-based. I don't know the intricate details of how they make their decisions on cutting areas, but I mean, you drive through Shawnee, and it doesn't seem like there's a shortage of places that you could hunt grouse.
Yeah.
And those are some of the questions that we have. You know, we know that we've seen a broad-scale decline in young forest in the state, and that has paired with our slow, steady decline of grouse. So the question becomes, in some of these areas where we have seen improvement, why are we not seeing improvement in the grouse population?
Right.
So we know that habitat has driven the population down on a broad scale. Is disease holding them back from occupying new habitats in these areas? Did we allow that population to fall below a level where they can replenish their numbers?
That's
And I mean,
my
that's,
question.
Yeah.
and we have those concerns with a lot of our
Sure.
game bird species. You know,
Sure.
we talk American woodcock. American woodcock, you can cut an acre of habitat in the middle of Ohio. Doesn't need to really be forested Ohio. And woodcock show up. They're migratory species that fall into good cover as they make their northward and southward movements. Rough grouse, if you do 200 acres of grouse management in a wooded area, but you don't have grouse in that township, or you don't have grouse in that county,
They ain't going to be there.
you're not gonna, and that's the same for quail, and that's the same for pheasant. You've got to have those birds nearby. And
Right.
translocation is not really a great option.
Yeah.
We're watching closely. Missouri is trying some translocation out of Wisconsin. That would not be an ideal situation for us, because we have Appalachian birds. We would want Appalachian birds. And the Appalachian region, as is illustrated here, is not doing well. So I get that question a lot too, is, well, why don't we get some birds and bring them into these areas that you said, have good grouse habitat, but maybe we're not seeing good numbers. Well, there aren't going to be any Appalachian states that are willing to give up grouse.
Right. Right.
They have 3 of them too.
Right.
I mean,
Interesting
that's
to
just
see what
Why
happens
don't we,
with that.
like,
Yeah.
It sounds like they've done a lot of habitat management in Missouri, and they think they're ready
So-
for them, or they think.
Yeah, that's an interesting project they got going on out there. I've read up about that.
And
So
so-
if you've got the habitat and you bring birds,
how many years do you have to work?
What do you mean?
Like, till you retire? How old?
Oh, good question.
25.
When I started, it was 30. It's now 32.
So, I mean, we- I got
So-
too. These guys here, like me, they probably don't give a rip if they shoot a bird in Shawnee, right? So we need to propose to make Shawnee a refuge, start bringing in some birds and manage and see what happens. But until you retire, then open the back.
So bringing in birds from where?
I don't know. But you know, like they'd have to be an installation. But if you just bring in 3 birds and put them in an area and you know, and just see, you know, I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's a stupid proposal. But
No,
you
no,
gotta,
no.
You gotta have, like,
Trust
you
me.
either gotta,
So in Missouri, they're moving 300 birds.
Yes.
They're moving 100 birds per year for,
I mean, I don't know what it'd be, but it's a proposal.
and they're hoping that that'll work.
And say, well, we don't care if we hunt because there's not that many birds.
Yeah.
These guys here for the rough grouse, they're not like they don't get
Right.
to shoot a bird. They all travel out of the state, and it's like, well, okay, we want to have birds in the state of Ohio or not.
So,
I mean, so
not a stupid idea. That wasn't my intent there.
but I know you
but-
can't find birds, but you're thinking, okay, why can't
We want
they-
an Appalachian bird.
Yeah, you have
That's
to
what
have
we've
it,
got.
yeah.
And there aren't really any Appalachian states that are going to be willing to give up those birds at this point. Not to mention, you put those birds under a lot of stress, and that's quail, that's pheasant,
Exactly.
that's rough grouse, that's turkey. Now, some of those birds handle it better than others, but you put those birds under a lot of stress, not only in trapping but in translocation. And then to reach that couple hundred bird level, it takes a
What's your
considerable
mortality
effort.
rate? Yeah.
Right.
So, I mean, we've
Takes
seen that
revenue.
we've seen that with
Moving in
quail.
the back of a pickup
You know,
truck.
we move birds from
95 to 2 a day,
Kansas
right?
Can people actually raise grouse legally?
You can legally with the proper permit.
Because I had
They are difficult not only to find in captivity, but as I understand it, much more difficult to rear in captivity, which is why they're not.
That's why.
well,
Nobody does it.
long story short, back in Lewisburg, where I live, my dad, they're in their 80s now, the man's just died, but his dad actually raised I mean,
Yeah.
he raised trout. He literally, I mean, he wouldn't let anyone back here. And I mean, I don't know how he did it, because we went back there, but, you know, he had all these different birds and stuff like that. I'm thinking, okay, if he can do it, why can't, I don't know, I'm just
It can
throwing
be done.
stupid stuff out the window, but you're just thinking, well, okay, so you get a fine, I mean,
It can be done, but then
Then you can't
You get
really
it.
release them to the wild because they're not going to sustain.
Then they're
them.
not wild birds. The
So
same
I
problem you have
will
a
bring
quail.
up
And,
this
yeah.
but you never know. I mean, it's there again. I mean, I've had quail. How do I raise quail,
Yeah.
turn them out on my training ground?
Mhm.
Some make it, some don't. Some
Yeah.
are stupid, some get killed by birds, but some do make it through 3,000. Some guys make
So-
it go bare.
So it's I
I
will
don't
say
know. But yeah, I
it's,
agree with you. I mean, how do you know?
it's not an impossibility, but it is, I will say, deceiving. So in your quail example, you will have birds that'll last till the next spring.
And
And they
then
will.
what after that? Why is that?
Well,
Predators?
they are not. There's a extremely high death rate right out of the gate. Those birds are very naive, and we see that with a number of
No, I'm
studies.
with you.
They're extremely naive. Those few that are not and do persist, their reproductive rates are
Low.
very low, very, very low. So, as an example, I forget if this was a quail or pheasant study done by the state of Ohio a couple decades ago, but they used captive birds and compared it to radio marked hens. I want to say this was quail. 100 wild birds with a radio collar, they produced 30 successful broods, so about a 30% success rate. Those hens raised a brood of some size to adulthood. One of the captive birds did that, and then they were killed shortly thereafter, the brood and the hen.
That makes
So-
sense.
The nesting rate is lower. The success of that nest is lower. I mean, some of them just flat don't incubate.
Yeah.
They just don't. There's
No,
something
there's
about
no-
those
yeah.
birds, they don't have the instinct.
I got you.
So you may see a bird whistling, you may see a hen out in the field a year after a release. We see that with our pheasant releases as well. Occasionally cocks will be out on the road in an area we know there aren't really wild pheasants. That's likely one of our birds. But if they don't reproduce, then you're not going to have birds into the future. But it is very misleading with your state agency representative telling you all those pen-reared releases don't work, and then you have birds months later after a release. Well, talk to me 2 years later or 3 years later after you've stopped releasing. That's the other part of it is
What's the
I'll get
conversion?
people saying,
Yeah.
well, I've had quail on my property for 6 years. And I say, well, what's your release rotate? Well, I release every spring. I release 100 birds every spring. Well, you bring
You're repopulating.
Yeah, yeah.
You're the breeder.
Neighbors say, I saw your birds down here.
So-
I mean, just because I think I got died to a place and not necessarily there.
That's really,
So-
that's part of the, I mean, the allure of a grouse is that it's not like
wild.
that.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a wild,
And
right?
that was one of the beautiful things, me moving out of the quail and pheasant world into the grouse and woodcock world, is these are
True
wild
wild.
birds.
Yeah.
And when I would get a call from a quail or pheasant hunter in my office, and I get calls of all sorts, quail or pheasant hunter, we'll say half the time, it was just, when are you going to start releasing birds? Or more birds. They want releases.
Yeah.
I get a call from a grouse hunter or a woodcock hunter,
Yeah.
and it's, I want habitat. When are you going to have more woodcock habitat in my county or this county or this wildlife area? They know that habitat drives the population of wild birds, and that's a great thing. That's why your state agency is here. It's what we're here to provide for the residents of Ohio. So, real quick before we move too far away from it,
Yeah.
captive grouse. We had a landowner attempt this a couple years ago. He contacted Heather Shaw, asked her input. He contacted us, asked our input. We advised him against it. He chose to move forward anyway. We let him know that the success rate would not be great, and we let him know the various permits that he would have to have, and he was bringing them from out of state, so he had to go through some disease. He did all that. He did everything that he needed to do. Since he was moving forward anyway, we contacted him and said, hey, this doesn't happen very often. There's not a lot of people that buy. He bought 25 grouse, I believe. There's not a lot of people that do this. We have a a stash of radio collars from a quail study. Very small collars. They were built for quail, going on a bird several times larger than a quail. Generally, the concern is the weight of that collar on a bird. So, quail collar, not a real problem for a grouse. We said, hey, these are quail collars. They're very small. They'll likely have little impact on your birds at all. Quail, collars of a significant weight can't have an impact on bird survival. He generously agreed. He said, come on up. Birds arrive on this day. Apply your collars. We'll track them and see what they do, and they had mortality switches in them, so it's a little, I think it's a mercury switch.
So if you get no movement, then
exactly. If the bird's moving, it sends one signal, and that's how we can track the birds. Beep, beep, beep. If that signal or if that switch has no movement at all, I think it's an 8-hour switch, 8 hour, 12 hours. Either way, the frequency of the not the radio frequency, but the frequency of the beep that you're receiving, the tone that's emitted changes. Beep, 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 beep. You know that bird's dead. In tracking hundreds of quail with those same collars, we never had a mortality signal on a bird that was alive. We occasionally had dead birds that the collar did not go into mortality because the wind blows it and it moves a little, or maybe a critter's tugging at it and it moves it just enough. But never did we have a bird that went into a mortality signal and then we got there and the bird flushed and or ran away. So keep that in mind. We marked all of his birds. We banded them as well, those that weren't banded already by the propagator. Propagator was present. He's very comfortable with the size of the collar and the way that we applied it. And then we released those birds. The landowner released those birds in the fashion that he preferred. It was a fairly large property. He managed it for grouse. I mean, whether it was specifically managed for grouse or not, I don't know. I think there was some interest in deer, but they were doing a number of clear cuts for deer that were beautiful. Grouse habitat. They had quite a bit of aspen as well. So I could not have made any recommendations for improvement on the habitat in the areas that on his property. The grouse did not survive a month. Most were dead within a week. And I hope to have some of that information published at some point when I can sit down and do that. But he has seen grouse on the property since the release, which he thought might be an indication that there had been some success. He had seen his sons, or hunters on the property, had seen grouse prior to the release as well. So it's probably very likely that he's continuing to see wild birds along the property.
Right. So all 25 of the birds perished?
All of them that we marked, either we recovered remains after a mortality signal, or we had a mortality signal and then lost the signal. Some of the times that we flew for the signal, so our waterfowl biologist was doing waterfowl surveys in that area, and he would just fly over. I would give him a list of frequencies. He would check each of them. So then we're not, of course, able to land and go down and search for what might have happened to that bird. So I was on the property twice, I think. After they flew and got a list of mortalities, I would go to each of those mortalities and try to find remains of the bird. Sometimes we found remains, sometimes we didn't. Most of the time, those collars are not coming off the bird's head, unless they were applied incorrectly, which I was pretty careful about that. So enough room on the neck for birds to feed, but not enough room that the collar's going to come off the head, unless the head is no longer attached.
Makes it a little different.
Yes. So when we were finding a collar, I was pretty confident that bird was dead and had been consumed. Pulled apart and sold. We did have a couple birds that just the signal disappeared. Again, these were recycled quail collars,
They
some
could
of
have
them
malfunctioned.
some of them could have been
Yeah.
out for a full season, and the battery life had been drained
Yeah.
to a point where we only got a few days of the signal. So I mean, I didn't intend to go into that today, but your question about
Yeah.
about captive grouse, so that is at a statewide level, that would be a lot of resource poured into birds that have very little chance of survival, and the best evidence that we have shows they're not going to survive.
So we got to work with what we got.
Correct.
Habitat.
Habitat in the areas we've still got wild birds.
Yep.
And you guys are all aware of things that are going on in Pennsylvania. They're even reaching a point where they're going to potentially key in on habitat in areas where they think West Nile virus is the least threat. So a certain elevation,
right.
birds are not going to be exposed as frequently to mosquitoes and West Nile virus. We don't have that luxury. If we've got grouse pockets in the state, in areas that we can manage habitat, we just need to do it.
Right.
Mosquitoes are not. So some of the things that are occurring in other states like that are just not an option for Ohio at this point.
So since a woodcock's a migratory bird, so we can manage for woodcock then more easier than grouse.
Certainly can, yeah.
Put the
And
money
that's
into the woodcock habitat more than trying to replenish the grouse. Because
American-
you want to have birds going coming all the time.
American woodcock.
Our chapter does a habitat project for woodcock every spring.
Oh, really?
We do it at Indian Creek, and we do it at Bott. So we go
I know
and
about that. I got to get in your guys' chapter. I
Yeah.
don't think I'm in your chapter.
yeah.
Yep.
American woodcock is one of the few that still say if you build it,
So when you say you get these calls from grouse and woodcock hunters, and people say, when are you going to be doing this, or why isn't anything happening in my town? Do you ask them, so have you started a grouse society or a woodcock society chapter in your area? Not what are we doing, what are you doing?
Yeah,
What are
I mean-
you doing?
I mean, that is a good point.
You know, I mean, you could give them direct
Send them
stuff.
my way, man. Tell them to call me.
I often do highlight Indian Creek. So some of the folks that called me recently, I think it was the gentleman on your list for attending today. Hey, how about some good woodcock hunting suggestions?
Yeah.
You know, Cincinnati chapter does a lot of work at Indian Creek, and I often
we do.
hear
And they're doing
And there's
well.
great
good.
woodcock there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we run into them every year.
It was last March. I was out in Indian Creek, and I saw Scott Chafee, a professional dog trainer from Michigan. His pickup truck and a
Big-ass trailer.
full rig trailer behind him was running his dogs
Yeah,
at Indian Creek before heading up to Michigan for the spring
Yeah.
trials.
it's
And,
Good news travels fast.
it is
So be quiet.
No, there's good woodcock at Indian Creek.
No.
it is an opportunity that I think is probably underutilized in Ohio by
Yes.
bird hunters.
So
I mean,
I'm, you know,
the
out
other
of state people know
Yeah,
out of state
yeah.
people know how good it is.
The other real common comment I get is, hey, I just bought this really expensive dog and you don't have any grouse and you don't have any quail and I don't know where to find the pheasants, and
What the
I
heck you
say,
buy the dog
well,
for?
have you tried woodcock? And it's like,
What's a woodcock?
yeah, that's it. It's like, what are you talking about? And I'll
You
say,
talking about snipe hunting?
we've got a woodcock diary now, just as we've got the grouse diary. During the peak migration, which is first week of November, roughly, give or take a little bit of time, you're talking 3 birds per hour,
Yeah.
and that's on average. So that's guys that send me zeros during that time, and I kind of want to call them and say, I don't think you're in the right cover. And that, you know, other people are encountering 5-6 birds an hour during that time to bring that average to about 3.
Yeah.
Like we were hunting at Indian Creek in March. We were doing a dog training day with our crew, and we had a bunch of dogs out. And I mean, we were blowing woodcock all day. They were, I mean, they were just coming through like on that point.
Yeah,
It was
I mean,
great.
if you time it right and you're in the right place, you know,
Oh, I got those
it can be as good as anywhere else that I've been.
Yeah.
I think you have to be a truly a bird dog, bird lover.
Yeah.
Be out there
I'll tell you what I
Take a
run
look out
into
in the
is
spring, yeah.
deer hunt, bow hunting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of my better covers, and I hunt a lot in Benton County, and
Yeah.
you go in there in early November, late October, early November,
Yeah.
and I come back from Michigan the 1st of November, and it's just full of bow hunting.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
that's
And that can be a
some
challenge.
of my better
yeah.
covers. I don't even get my dog in until
Yeah.
Yeah.
after gun season.
Yeah, I mean that's a real concern for me too. I not only do I not want to disrupt their hunt, but I don't want my dog
Right.
under their stand.
Yeah, that's
Right.
what I worry about.
Yes.
So I kind of pick and choose, and it's like, you know, I'll still run the dogs, and I'm not hunting where I really want to hunt
yeah, yeah.
Right.
until later in the season.
And I mean, when it's good, when you're in the peak of migration, you really don't need that many locations. And I found that I'm acquiring additional locations not because I need them to get my birds. It's because I see a truck
Right.
and I go, wow, that's
move on.
probably a bow hunter. I need another spot.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm going to hunt somewhere.
And in general, as I said, when it's good, when you timed it right, one spot's as good as the next. If you've got the same cover.
Yeah.
So for me, it's a little bit different than you all down in a little more forested region of the state. I'm hunting agricultural central Ohio, and it's river corridors where you
Right.
find a lot of the good wood. So
So where you out of, Mark?
Union County is where I live, north of Marysville. So Big Island Wildlife Area, I hunt quite a bit. Delaware it can be very good. So you look at the landscape there and you don't think woodcock hunting, but you find the right cover and they're there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Let's go look at
I
some
don't know if
traps.
we've- I was gonna say I don't know if we've delayed long enough. Let's head
everybody's
to
here
some
now.
traps.
Yeah.
So what we're gonna do? We'll head down to 52,
Okay.
make a right, and we're gonna go all the way to Pond Run.
Okay.
There's a Pond Lick.
Pond Lick.
Okay.
Pond Lick.
Okay.
Pond Run.
Yeah.
We will end up. If I didn't give away all the maps. If you want to circle on your map.
You get a pen, a circle.
Here, hold the map.
So.
Pond Lick is right here. Right there. It's Pond Lick right
so
there.
yeah, that's the confusing part. We want Pond Run right down here. We could come in that way, but what we're
Pond
going
Run
to
is
do.
where?
Pond Run is right off 52 here.
Oh, Pond Run.
Pond
Okay.
Run Road.
Right here.
And then we're going to go on Forest Road 13.
Is that where
Right
we
there,
do the
Forest Road
drummer
right there.
survey, starting down?
No. We do Upper
No,
Twin
No,
Creek.
that's down here. That's,
We do Upper Twin Creek.
I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
And then Forest
Okay.
Road 2.
Where we're going to end up is right here at this three-way intersection.
Oh, okay, sure.
Okay.
And I mean, there are other ways to get in there certainly, but
Yeah,
this is
all
the
right,
simplest
okay, all right.
Okay. Perfect.
for me. We did trap in this area.
Uh-huh.
This is where a number of birds were flushed in February.
Got it.
We ran traps all along that road back into the back here. We actually took some back in here, and those were some that we moved after 2 weeks. We're not going to go look at any of those. It's behind the gate. I can't
So
open the gate
trail.
for you guys.
Okay.
So we're going to go look at some of the
Here.
more
Okay,
accessible
all right.
traps
Here.
in this
We're gonna
region.
end up in here.
Okay.
So we can park at this three-way intersection
Okay.
right here.
And then just
And
walk.
then
We can
just make a
carpool.
short
Brian, if
walk.
you want to
Okay,
jump in with
all right.
us, or
Okay, all right.
And then the
Sure,
second
if you don't mind.
yeah, we'll bring you back.
second location will be
Okay.
Mackle
Yeah,
Trail.
well,
All right.
But we'll all meet here
oh,
first.
well, since you
Just a
don't
couple
have
hills.
it, fine.
Yeah.
Just a
okay.
couple hills.
All right. Okay, good.
So we can try to stay together, but does everybody feel comfortable where we're going?
Yep,
We don't make
yep.
it?
Yep.
I do now.
Where are we at now?
Huh?
Where are we now?
Right. See, here's
So here's 125.
125.
So we'll pass 125. So we're sort of in
Probably around that little
that.
spot
Yeah,
right
probably.
there.
Okay, so we're just going down the road a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
Down 52
To the
and,
right. Got it. Okay.
to the right.
Following you.
We're gonna follow Mark. Everybody follow Mark. He knows where he's going.
Tell Brian to sit behind me. Sit behind me.
You have more room.